Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colony Government Channel.
Steve needs no introduction. We wouldn't have so many people. You guys all know him. He's going to tell us about this book, which I had time to read finally, a new book review book. It was really fascinating. Gigantic personalities. It's called Scorpions, The Battles and Triumphs of FDR's Great Supreme Court Justices. So here's Steve to tell us.
Thanks. Okay, thank you. I see our audience is not getting any younger. I can say that now. I'm right there with you. Actually, it's very interesting about this because if you were somebody who cared about constitutional history at any age, especially if you like law, this is a fascinating book. And it's a fascinating book for a lot of reasons, not the least of which, and if anybody has any questions during the time you want to ask me anything, the way I do this, I just break it up and whatever you want to do, we answer any questions. Scorpions is a book about the four great liberal or seemingly liberal judges appointed by Roosevelt: Frankfurter, Black, Jackson, and Douglas. And these were four judges who didn't just have an influence on American life. They had a profound, deep, lasting influence over our lives, over what certainly in the 60s and 70s and 50s, what a lot of people don't understand who are non-lawyers, and it's easy for lawyers to say, well, you're not a lawyer and you don't understand. On the three branches of government, I saw yesterday, for example, in the paper that the amount of appointments now being made and being approved by the Senate is really slowed down because Republicans are fighting with Obama. Obama's got like 109 appointments that he can make in district court judges. Tip O'Neill once said, all politics is local. Well, law in many ways is local. Your district court judges down in Albany, your appellate division judges, not the Supreme Court judges, they're the ones who influence our lives. Simple things like rights for the poor, gays, blacks, whatever, ultimately it bubbles up to the Supreme Court, true, but that's the front line of things. But ultimately, of course, we end up with the major cases going to the Supreme Court. And this is a book about the four men, and they are men, because until the 1990s, women were not qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. And until the 1960s, blacks were not considered to be able to sit on the Supreme Court. So you're talking about an era, as you all know, where it's men. And generally men, some Jews, only a couple of Jews up to the 1950s were appointed to the Supreme Court, Brandeis being one of them. So if you were Jewish, if you were a minority, if you were a woman, until the 60s or 70s and Johnson came in and Kennedy, you were not getting on the Supreme Court. And that kind of is part of the not the theme of the book, but it's an historical analysis of the book as to the world we lived in. Now, if you think about this, in 1939, when most of these men were actually appointed in the space of about 2 or 3 years, this was a country that had been historically conservative, very conservative. Teddy Roosevelt was the last, if you want to call him liberal, progressive president we had, and he got out in 1908. Taft went in 1912, and Wilson in part, but Wilson was very conservative, particularly socially and economically. So you've got a period of almost a quarter of a century where members of the Supreme Court, with a few exceptions, have been appointed by Republican conservative judges, all through the 20s, for example. Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. Roosevelt comes in, you get the New Deal, you have this tremendous social upheaval. Now, the country is now moving in different directions. Unions are starting to organize. Women, not so much in terms of a separate group. Blacks starting to bubble up a little bit, but under the surface. But basically, it becomes a highly energized union movement in the 1930s. And with that, you have an extremely conservative Supreme Court. You have a progressive president. If you want to call him progressive, call him liberal. You now have a Congress which is heavily dominated by the Democrats after the Great Depression. And you have all this legislation coming in and being passed by Congress. Now moving to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is uniformly declaring these statutes unconstitutional. So you've got the court standing in the way of things today that we take for granted. Minimum wage. The Supreme Court in 1936 said unconstitutional. Can't do it. States can't enforce minimum wage, and other things like that. Roosevelt's becoming more embittered by this. And he calls it 9 old men. Because your average age in the Supreme Court at that time, you had many of the men were in their 70s. Now, many of you here today may have retired or maybe working part-time. If you're a Supreme Court judge, 95, 98, you don't even have to be cogent or competent. All you have to do is be able to breathe and have someone raise your arm, and you can be a Supreme Court judge for life. And it happens. There are people on the Supreme Court, I think Rehnquist retired, 6 years ago, and he was pretty ill. Supreme Court judges are like popes. They go on forever. And sometimes they finally retire. Stevens just retired, he's 90. So you've got all these men on the Supreme Court. You've got Roosevelt, who's getting progressively more irritated by what's happening. And he decides, as many of you know, I remember in grammar school, to pack the court because he's going to add more judges. Now, everybody tells him, don't do this. Even the judges on the Supreme Court, Brandeis and Holmes, come out strongly against him because it's institutional. It fails. But the Supreme Court starts to change because people on that court begin to see the writing on the wall, and they know, listen, life is changing. And ultimately, Roosevelt does something which no one has ever done before or since, and he's there 4 terms. He appoints all members of the Supreme Court. By the time he leaves office or dies, which is leaving office, I guess, he has appointed the entire Supreme Court. And his influence on that court survives in many ways even to this day. The 4 people that are written about in this book are fascinating characters. And I was talking to Joe, who said I was kind of interested about how a lot of these judges make their minds up before something, or they're influenced by outside events. What this book really establishes, if you're interested, is how political the Supreme Court is. Now, you have men and women today, but judges who are tremendously political in a different way back then than they are now, but this court was really political. Frankfurter gets appointed, I think he's of the 4, he's the first by Roosevelt. Brilliant, City College of New York, immigrant, Jewish, tremendous name in the legal community, Harvard Law School. He goes up. Frankfurter ultimately turns out to be very conservative. Very bright, has a judicial philosophy, judicial restraint. What Congress says is the law, or what Congress has passed, I'm not going to go beyond Congress. Then he appoints Black. Now, it's not in this book, so I'm not sure this is true. I had read something that Frankfurter wrote his memoirs, and his memoirs are written for history. It's like Winston Churchill once said, history would treat me well, for I intend to write it. Frankfurter, on all these conferences and meetings and opinions, he's writing these memoirs to obviously make himself look good. I read later that Black did not know how much he disliked him. Thought he was just a buffoon from the South. He was just a hayseed. They had nothing in common from the background. Black was somebody who was from the soil of Alabama, had worked hard, came from a poor family, had gone to the University of Alabama Law School, had 2 profs. As many of you may know, in the 1920s, he became a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And that became a big part of Black's life. He repudiated it later that he'd been a member, but clearly he was a member. Today, Hugo Black, you wouldn't even get him into Congress with that kind of a background. And now the difference is, if you watch the appointments now, and they come up to the Hill, and the judges sit there and they give these very solemn-esque statements, yes, and they're all lying. Oh, I haven't made a decision on abortion, and gay rights, I really haven't thought about that. And pornography, good question, Senator, we're going to consider that. And they all go through this little game, which everybody knows is a fraud. When a sotomayor went up before, and they said, no, Judge, there's some questions about your judicial demeanor. And, oh, yeah, sometimes I can be difficult. A lot of people tell you that she was a pain in the neck. She was very, very aggressive. But nonetheless, that's today's way of doing things. And it got a lot worse after the Bork nomination back in the late 80s. Back then, you got appointed unless you really had something, a problem in your background. And Black did have a problem, because even in 1939 or 40, when he got appointed, being a member of the Klan was a problem. But they got him through, so he comes on the bench. And then after him, Jackson and Douglas, I forget now which is which. I think Douglas was first. Douglas is from the West, political, very charming, 4 wives. When he dies, he's got wife number 4, but he ain't spent a lot of time with wife number 4. He's got girlfriend number 44. And he was a Randy, there's no question about it. And then Jackson, who is the last great judge appointed by Roosevelt, actually gone to Albany Law School, and is the last person to sit on the Supreme Court who did not graduate from law school, went 1 year. He was from Buffalo. Now, what do these men have in common aside from the fact that they all had a connection to Roosevelt? You know, the word brilliant and genius gets really overstated. You know, he's brilliant, he's a genius, or she's brilliant, and they're not. But these are 4 incredibly gifted men. 4 men who came to the Supreme Court with very diverse backgrounds. 4 men who, as they sat on the Supreme Court, each of whom grew on the Supreme Court and understood his place on that court and understood very well the history of the court and what it meant to the country. There's a reason why the Scorpions, and it's written by someone who's obviously very, very enamored with the 4 men and is liberal, so if you want to, this book is written by a liberal. It's not written by a conservative. If you had a conservative writing this, I'm sure you'd see a different book. But there are 4 men who came to the court and looked at some of the tremendous issues that were now developing in the country, and all were influenced, as you have to be, by their prior background. If you remember the case Sacco-Vanzetti back in the 1920s, which is the communists and the conspiracies, and they got convicted of there's still a question whether they actually done the bombing in Boston. Frankfurter, for example, became a huge voice for Sacco-Vanzetti as a private attorney. And a lot of people thought he was one of the great liberals. Frankfurter, when he gets on the bench, grows over the years, and these men are on the bench, by the way, not just 5 or 10 years. Douglas served, I think, 35 years. Black was about 30 years. Jackson died in 1955. He was 15 or 16 years, died of a heart attack. And Frankfurter was 25 or 27 years. So they were on the court a long time. And being on there a long time, they had enough time to learn to hate one another, which is what happened. And there's some tremendous stories in this book. For example, which I like, you know, so much of history is so poorly written. And you talk to somebody, well, you know, I don't like him because, you talk to historians because that guy isn't a real historian. In many ways, what they're saying is he or she can write. And it's interesting. And you read it and say, gee, I can't wait to the next page. I read 2 books in the French Revolution that my son's teacher gave me. One, he said, read this, was fascinating. The second book, I got 200 pages. It was the most boring thing in the world. It was factual. It was, you could learn things, and it was boring. You couldn't wait to put that book down. This book is interesting because they have these little vignettes. and these little asides, but it tells you a whole lot about each other, or each of the men. In 1940, for example, there was a case that was decided by Black, and his former law partner had argued the case, and he went with this law professor. Now, for Black, as a Southerner, Hugo Black, honor meant everything. I mean, that was their credo. And you can say, well, the Klan, but there were millions of people in the Klan in the 20s. But Hugo Black, if you insulted his honor, you insulted him for life. That's the way it was. So he's written an opinion, and apparently he's in a hurry to get the opinion out. And some people in the court get to the belief that he's doing this to protect his law partner of 20 years ago who had argued the case, which is not true. Black was not trying to help him out. Jackson, who begins to not like Black, if you're a Supreme Court judge and you don't want to sit on the case, you just recuse yourself. You don't give a reason. I'm not sitting. You may see this almost a scandal now with, for example, Scalia and Thomas. They're in some organization down in Puerto Rico or something, and they're traveling, and there's a big question, shouldn't you recuse yourself? They can or they can't, that's up to them. This is very, very inbred, the Supreme Court. Black refuses to recuse himself. Now inside the Supreme Court, this question, should you? So they have a conference, and now it's starting to get a little heated, where Jackson and Black are now starting to come after each other. And Harlan Stone is the chief judge, and he calls a conference. And Black says, I am not writing an opinion as to why I'm recusing myself, or not recusing myself. I don't have to, I'm not doing it. Jackson says, well, I'm going to write an opinion that's simply saying that the Supreme Court judges have it within their discretion whether or not to recuse himself, which is a clear shot at Black at his honor, because no one ever does this. And Black turns to Jackson and says, if you write that opinion, this is war. Right there in the conference. And Stone says, gee, this isn't going the way I hoped it would. Says, fine. Jackson, now, unless you really know the inner workings, you don't know this. But Black has now been insulted by being called a liar and a fraud. And if you're Hugo Black, you just don't do that. Jackson writes the opinion, basically bland. Black never forgets. And Black also gets even. And here's how he gets even. And it is a fascinating story. Jackson, Douglas wanted to be president of the United States. That's why Frankfurter hated Douglas, absolutely hated Douglas. Douglas and Black did not like Jackson or Frankfurter. So Douglas didn't like Frankfurter, and Douglas was more of a, not a dilettante, he was brilliant, but you know, Frankfurter would labor over these opinions and Douglas would kind of insult him. So Jackson was desperately hoping to be the chief judge. And one of the chief judges dies, I think, in the war, and Roosevelt doesn't think it's time and doesn't appoint him to the chief judgeship, which really annoys Jackson, who thinks he has a promise from Roosevelt to be appointed. Then the chief judge dies when he is now the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. He's not in Washington. And he thinks that Truman is going to appoint him because now all the stars are aligned. Jackson's clearly a great judge, great thinker, great judge, political. The problem is, as he's over in Europe, his supporters are back here, but there's one detractor back in Washington who has not forgotten, and that's Hugo Black. And Hugo Black now starts to run the campaign against Jackson. And that ends up, if not wholly, but in large part, costing Jackson the chief judgeship. And as he points out in this book, if you know anything about the South and men like Black, when they say they never forget, they never forget. Jackson, of course, comes back, sits on the bench. He knows that Black has been the one who's taken him out. So if they hated each other before, Now they despise each other. So you now have two judges sitting there who absolutely detest one another, and two great judges. You're not talking about a schlep and an all-star. You're talking about, for example, taking Black. Let's take Frankfurter first. Frankfurter comes on the bench, and he's somebody who always wanted to be a Supreme Court judge. So he gets on the bench, 1939, 1940, and he continues to communicate with Roosevelt. Things that we think today would be conflicts of interest, Supreme Court judges used to play cards and poker with Roosevelt and Truman, which I didn't know this. Roosevelt's games are all, he wanted to have people around, they're all political, they're all fun, he wanted to get information, and he had people, source of information coming to him. Truman's card games, they were big deals. That was real money at those games, and a lot of drinking at those games. So, but Frankfurter would go to these games, and Douglas would play in them regularly. So Frankfurter comes on the bench in the late 30s, and he goes on the bench for about 20 years, and he begins to disappoint a lot of the liberals in the country because Frankfurter, who has an exquisite intelligence, begins to accept what's called judicial restraint. And it's interesting because one of the cases that he comes on, which he had criticized a great deal in the past, this was a case, names I don't think are that important, Lochner versus the state of New York. And Lochner was, which is really starts this court packing thing. Lochner is a case in which New York had passed a law of minimum wage, that you couldn't do anything more than 60 hours or minimum work week, a maximum work week of 60 hours a week. Anyway, Lochner was from Buffalo, around Buffalo, Lackawanna, I think, and they find that he's got somebody working for him more than 60 hours a week. So New York State finds him. He takes it up, goes to New York, goes to circuits, goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court strikes New York statute, calling it the liberty of contract, which no one knows what the hell is that supposed to be, meaning that he had a right, Lochner, to contract with his worker, and therefore the state should not intervene. Frankfurter, at the time, as a practicing attorney, writes a scathing article about this, and he's widely respected, that this is ridiculous, that certainly Congress has a right to pass a statute, that for now the Supreme Court to, and by the way, to have somebody work more than 60 hours a week, you mean to tell me we can't progressively run, the Constitution has changed? That's what causes the court packing. Now Frankfurter gets on the bench. But Frankfurter actually becomes fairly consistent. Like most consistent opinions in the Supreme Court, you can get boxed. Consistent with his view that judicial restraint, he says, well, if Congress has passed it, there's nothing I can do about it. His liberal friends are saying to him, what are you talking about? You've got all these things that are going on, these work wages, these labor unions, these other things progressively in the country, and you are allowing this to go on. Frankfurter becomes more and more of a very, very much a conservative and not willing to bend. And that, now the war is pointed out here, in the time of war, courts always take a back step to Congress because they're not out in front and they weren't in the Supreme Court, with one big exception. And the big exception, of course, is the Japanese internment case. And that's the case, which you may know, back on the West Coast, the United States comes up with the idea that all the Japanese Americans are potential conspirators. And so what we do in the country, we herd hundreds of thousands of Japanese into these camps out west, I think in Oregon, and just take them from their homes. It's like taking everybody in this room and saying, you're a white American, you're an Irish American, you're whatever American, we don't care if you're American, based upon your race only, we're going to put you in these camps. And they, obviously, a case is brought against that, saying, listen, this is illegal. It's done by executive order. And oddly enough, the four judges, three of whom become great liberals, support Roosevelt on this. Some of the other conservatives are apoplectic about this. They are absolutely, there's no basis for this. You're taking hundreds of thousands of people, throwing them in these war camps without due process, without habeas corpus, with nothing, no rights to come into court, there's been absolutely nothing. And that has, if you want to know whether that theory is still applicable, go to Guantanamo Bay. Whether you agree or not agree, these same kinds of issues were back in the 1940s. What is the ability of the president to have an executive order to ship people to a Guantanamo Bay or some other place and just leave them there? Well, you know, they're Arabs, they're Muslims, they're terrorists. Well, maybe they are. But don't they have a right to have a hearing and have a court determine why we're holding them? So we held the Japanese for about 2 years there. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in some conditions that were not prisoner of war camps, but they weren't terrific. And these judges, Douglas called it later the greatest shame of his life, that he voted to do that. But Roosevelt was president. These men all had strong contacts with Roosevelt. Don't forget, if you want to talk about politics, old Bob Jackson, he's thinking about being the chief of the Supreme Court. It's not going to look too good if FDR says one thing and Jackson says something else. Douglas wants to be president. And Douglas is angling with Roosevelt all the time. In fact, in 1944, Douglas gets that close to getting the nomination. I mean, he's really close. He's a Westerner. He's good looking. I don't know what wife he had at that point, but there are some questions about him. This is 1944, it's not 2004. And he's got a rabbi in Congress, and he's got Roosevelt, who obviously is getting very ill. Roosevelt ultimately goes to the convention and says to the convention, and Truman's got a real rabbi there, a real political boss, and says to the convention, do whatever you want. But privately tells people, if I had my choice, I'd take Douglas. Well, if that happened, of course, Douglas would have been president. Truman gets appointed. Frankfurter hates Douglas because he thinks that Douglas is just using the Supreme Court for his own political gain, which during the 40s, there's something to be said about that. And the book tracks this whole thing about how Douglas is angling for doing things, and he goes to Roosevelt and he plays cards with Truman and everything else. In 1948, Truman offers him the vice presidential nod. Now, you don't see that today. Now, today, you become a Supreme Court judge, basically there for life, or maybe afterlife, no one knows. But but he turns it down because he doesn't think Truman has a chance of getting elected. After 48, probably like Kennedy after 1980, I know people can dislike Kennedy, but Kennedy became probably his greatest moments after 1980 when he no longer was going to be president and really ended up being a senator. So he wasn't doing things with his eye of the White House. After 48, Douglas realizes by 52 he's got an interest, but the time has passed. So now Douglas is going to remain a Supreme Court judge. Black grows during the war. People look at Black as this stumbling Southerner who's a former senator from Alabama, politician, the only one, by the way, who came from Congress. Douglas had come from the SEC. One of the great things about Douglas is when Douglas took a position, he didn't change. And that remained to the end of his life. And he was very, very bright. Using the word brilliant. He was very bright. And if he took a position on something, he stayed with that position. Black is somebody who, by most accounts, becomes one of the greatest growth stories in the Supreme Court. A man who really becomes the champion of the First Amendment. A man who, you looked at Hugo Black, the Klan, the South, you know, this United States Senator and all the people from the Northeast and Harvards and Yales, Siena. You know, who is this guy? Well, this guy becomes one of the great Supreme Court judges. A great, great intellect and a great advocate for the rights, the First Amendment rights in this country. So, you know, we take this Supreme Court stuff. There's cases back in the 1940s where Frankfurter, they're looking at Frankfurter, who was Jewish but never considered himself a Jew. He said, I'm Jewish, but I'm not religious. There's a case involving a kid at a high school who was forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Didn't want to do it. Absolutely was opposed to it. Supreme Court said they can make you do it. Today, we look at this and say, you got to be kidding me, the First Amendment? There's no way you could do that. You put a Hanukkah bush or a Christmas tree within 100 miles of this place, the town of Colony sending the police out to take it down. A lot different then. So Black leads the charge on that. Let's talk about Jackson for a moment, who's really one of the fascinating people. And I don't know where the author here, by the place he puts him in the book, is his own interpretation of who's the greatest and not greatest. But Jackson becomes, I have a law partner of mine named Neil Murray, went to the University of Michigan Law School. And he had a professor who said Robert Jackson was the greatest judge of the 20th century. In this book, he doesn't say this, but he says this: Robert Jackson was one of the two greatest writers of the 20th century. If you take Holmes and Jackson, and in some ways Jackson may have been the greatest writer of the 20th century. I mean, that is saying something. You're talking about the Supreme Court. And we were talking about this before. So many clerks write things today. Oh, these judges, Jackson, you know, you might have somebody do some research, but he wrote his own opinions. Douglas was known for it later. Douglas would be very quick, write things, and he was very quick. In the Steele takeover case in 1952, became a big case. The unions are rioting. We're in the war with Korea. Well, I guess we weren't in a war anymore. We were in a war in Vietnam because no one ever declared war. But like Afghanistan, we're not in a war, but just happen to have 50,000 people there. So Truman ordered the steel mills be taken over. And the Supreme Court ruled that he couldn't do it. And as the author points out, most people think that Jackson wrote the majority opinion. He didn't. He wrote a concurring opinion. But that opinion has turned out to be one of the great, according to this author, that may have been the greatest opinion of the 20th century, writing. Because it sets forth, not only is it well written, Jackson was known as being very practical. He had a practical answer for problems. How do we solve this practically? And he could explain it in a way that they make fun of Frankfurter. They said, here's what Frankfurter would say in the Gettysburg Address, which would be incomprehensible. But Jackson wrote, the president can do three things. One by himself, one with the will of Congress, two, over the will of Congress. And he analyzes all three things on presidential power, which has been cited by cases to this day as the greatest exposition of a presidential power, which exists even to this day, telling you the genius of these men who sat on this court and the way they could explain it. And this book is very good because it gives you an analysis of the clerks who worked with him. They loved him. Douglas, at the end of his life, was disliked by everybody. He was crotchety, he was cranky, he had some bad personal habits. Jackson was liked. Jackson goes over to, Jackson gets appointed to Nuremberg. And like everything else in life, you think about yourself and you say, was this a good idea? He always felt at the end of his life, had he not gone to Nuremberg, he would have been the chief judge. So he goes to Nuremberg, he gets appointed, and he's chief counsel at Nuremberg. But in terms of your history, when you think of Nuremberg, of course, you think of Robert Jackson, because he is the chief counsel. And all the books, Judgment Nuremberg, and all the other great books on Nuremberg, Jackson becomes the central figure. So while he may not have become the chief judge, he stands in a place that no one else has occupied as the chief prosecutor in the greatest trial in the history of man, Nuremberg. And Nuremberg, and I've read a couple of books on this. Joseph Persico, I know, has written a book, has spoken here before, wrote a great book on it. No one knows what the law is in Nuremberg. You come in and say, well, it's easy, you know, you killed 6 million Jews. Well, it's not quite that easy, because what is the standard you're going to use? The Russians, of course, wanted to hang all the Nazis, despite the fact that they were doing the same thing. And you had the British and the Americans and the Russians. And now here's Jackson trying to put all this together. He was there a year. And it's depressing and it's time consuming, and you're bringing all these Nazis in. And I'd read this before. One of the great historical moments in the case is Goering, who is the, I'm not sure I'd use the word great, but after Hitler, the lead Nazi, there's no question. And Goering, before Nuremberg, had become totally dissipated. He was a cocaine addict, a heroin addict. He used to walk around in these long coats and this bizarre behavior, morphine. He was grossly overweight and just let himself go. He'd been a fighter pilot in World War I. But like a lot of the Nazis, Goering was very, very able, extremely bright. So now Goering's in Nuremberg, and now Goering's cleaning himself up. And after 6 months or a year, I forget which, they go to trial. And the Nazis are all separated and everything, and Goering testifies. Jackson takes on Goering. He's taken on the others. Everybody knows this is the moment in this trial. It's Goering. Everybody else is a sideshow. And Goering has Jackson for lunch. Jackson decides to take him on. Horrible mistake. Goering is smart, and what everybody doesn't appreciate at the time is he's got an incredible knowledge and recollection and memory of the facts. So Jackson starts throwing exhibits at him, and Goering can say, well, that isn't what it says, Mr. Jackson, Justice Jackson. For example, one time, Jackson asked him a question, and he says to him, which is a minor question, he says, well, you've indicated that the Nazis disclose sorts of things, but I've got an exhibit here, Mr. Goering, that you didn't disclose this to the authorities about what the troop movements were of the Nazis. And Goering says, yeah. He says, well, Mr. Jackson, I wasn't aware that when we were in Berlin that the United States was disclosing us ahead of time what they intended to do with their troops. And if you're a cross-examiner, you start to look at this and say, listen, sometimes you get away from somebody. Jackson decided to come after him, and you couldn't do it. And Goering walked off. Now, Goering knew he was dead. There's no question. They were going to hang him, and he knew it. But Jackson, became a great humiliation of Jackson, but he'd been there for so long and so involved in this thing. If you go to a trial sometimes, and he didn't have somebody next to him tugging at his sleeve and said, sit down. In fact, it was warned, get away from him. It doesn't make a difference. But anyway, he goes, comes back, not the chief judge, becomes a tremendous writer and thinker on that court. Douglas outlives them all. Douglas goes into the late 70s. He's going through wise like he's going through water. He becomes the advocate for constitutional rights, due process, the environment, the Fourth Amendment. Jackson becomes hated by conservatives around the country, which he loves. I mean, now but it's very interesting, and the author points this out. A lot of well, you may not call them great because whatever your political beliefs are, a lot of the most important decisions of the 60s and 70s, people think of Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall had nowhere near the intellectual depth and breadth of Douglas. He had a great sense of what was right, if you're a liberal, but he was not a leader. The leader, though, becomes Brennan. Brennan is this Irish Catholic from New Jersey who gets along with everybody, who the conservatives on the court like him. He forges alliances. He does a lot of things that have to change. And the one man, one vote, which in the early 1960s, there's this big case that comes out of the South, and it's I forget the name of it now. I don't have time to talk about the case, which I should have. I'm sorry about the big Supreme Court case in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. That goes on for 2 years, and they know that they've got to change. Frankfurter and Jackson, and this is Jackson's last case because it's 1954. It gets argued in 1952. They need a unanimous vote on this case because they're sitting there saying, this case is, and even the Supreme Court, they know it's monumental. They know it. Vinson, who was appointed by Truman over Jackson, he and two others are going to dissent on the basis that Congress, that there's no right of the Supreme Court to start telling school districts how they're going to run your district. So others say, you know, we're going back to, remember, the 1930s, what can the court do? And Frankfurter is judicial restraint. Frankfurter is a liberal, Jewish, if you think Jewish liberal, and he's thinking, you know what? I don't know if we can do this. We don't have the authority to start telling school districts what to do. And today we say, you've got to be kidding me. But back in 1954, it's a whole different game. They argue before the Supreme Court. The case goes on like 6 or 8 months. Nothing happens. There's a huge fight inside the court as to what they're going to do. Vinson has two others, and he's going to dissent. Vinson dies. Eisenhower becomes president. Eisenhower makes an appointment which he says later is the worst appointment he ever made. Other people think it's his greatest. He appoints Earl Warren. Earl Warren gets on the court. Earl Warren ain't dissenting. Although it's interesting, Earl Warren was the Attorney General in California back in the 1940s who took all the Japanese Americans and put them in those internment camps. Warren comes on, and this is fascinating reading. I mean, it really is, because Brown versus Education is just, if you take the three most important cases in Supreme Court history, Brown, Dred Scott, and maybe one or two others, you start right off with Brown. So Brown gets re-argued, which is almost unheard of. Now they're on back. Now Warren's on board. Now he goes to Frankfurter and says, listen, you can't stand out on here in this. You've got, well, you can't concur, you can concur, but you've got to go with this. And they come up with this phrase, all deliberate speed, because they've got to get a vote, and they've got to get the 9 to come on. One holds out, or two. One folds, says, listen, I think it's Murphy, I forget. Warren goes to the last one, I don't know if it's, I forget who it was, I forget who it was. He says, you're out here by yourself. You want us going out there? You want to dissent on this by yourself? Well, I'm going to, fine, you can do it, but you're alone. And you're all alone. No, I don't think I want to be alone. So then, in the last case of the term, and everybody knows this case is coming. Everybody knows they've had 2 terms now. And every month and every week they're wondering, where is this decision? As a judge of the Supreme Court, as a chief judge, you have the authority to assign opinions. If you're in the majority, you don't have the right to assign it to the dissent. But if you're in the majority, then you assign it to whomever you want to assign it to. And oftentimes you assign it to the chief, the oldest judge, whatever. Warren assigns it to himself. And he comes out, and they start reading this opinion. This is like in June, and the place is packed, because it's near the end of the term. Everybody knows. And he starts reading it, and it's like, this is now an unbelievable case. And he starts saying, we find that this is Kansas, that the Kansas policy is unconstitutional. And the whole courtroom is, oh my God. This is a constitutional moment of historic proportions. How he describes this and how the judges come together and how Jackson and Douglas and everybody else, it's just fascinating. Now, we're 1 o'clock, right? Is that? Okay, so I don't want to hold. So, should you read the book? Well, wait till paperback. For me as a lawyer, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer, and I'm not an appellate lawyer, and a lot of the things they talk about, honestly, I had to reread to kind of get the thought. But he doesn't write it in language that you can't understand. But on the other hand, he writes it in a way like when I've had doctors on the stand, you say, doctor, can you talk in layman's terms? But I want a doctor talking about medical terms. Now, he doesn't get abstract or obscure, but he writes it in a way, he talks about law, he talks about personalities, he talks about events, He talks about movements. And he talks about these four men who were thrown together for 15 or 20 years. Jackson dies in 1955 at the apartment of the woman that everybody knew was his lover, who had actually been with him in Nuremberg. Of course, in those days, no one ever said anything. And the official version later was Jackson died on the way to the Supreme Court. Well, the problem was the woman's apartment is like about a mile and a half the other way. So maybe he did, but there was something else was going on. If you have an interest in events and those things and law, it's not written. If you're a lawyer who's been trained in law, you enjoy it. You may appreciate it. If you like history, if you like constitutional history, if you want to see something that's affected our lives, and the lives of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and well written, this is a very good book. If you said, I don't care so much about law, this is not a good book. It's not something that's going to interest you, because these men and their characters aren't going to come alive for you. But if you have an interest in that, it's very well written. It's entertaining. You get through it. It's not difficult. He sweeps across the plains from the 30s all the way to the 70s. And he is unapologetically liberal. There's no question about it. He's critical at times, but it does have a bias. So I enjoyed reading it very much, got a lot out of it, learned things I never knew, and even things I think I knew. When you hear some of the background, or you read some of the background, it's really pretty interesting. The one thing to reinforce what I think I knew anyway is how political the Supreme Court is, still is. And if you want to know, if someone says, well, how political is it really? Well, I can tell you how political. In 2000, the year 2000, we had a little case coming out of Florida. And that just determined who the next president of the United States was going to be. And that final vote was 5-4. Gore versus the state of Florida. And just by coincidence, and I know these things happen, the 5 judges who decided not to allow a recount and therefore helped Bush were all appointed by Republicans. And the 4 who thought there should be a recount were all appointed by Democrats. So they should have just stood up and said, listen, let's just make this easy for everybody, okay? We got 1, you got 0. That's the way this is going down, everybody. Okay, so thank you very much.